Can I sit here? 4 small words. That's all it took to change the life of a man who had convinced himself that his heart had already closed for good. If you've ever believed that kindness shown to a stranger could somehow find its way back to save your own life, stay with this story until the very end, because what happened between a tired single father and a little girl with one leg will remind you why we choose to keep believing in people, even after the world has given us every reason not to. And if stories like this move you, hit that like button and subscribe, because there's a lot more heart waiting for you on this channel. Daniel Cole had not smiled in 11 months. Not a real smile, anyway. Not the kind that reaches the eyes, the kind his late wife Rachel used to tease him about because it made the corners of his eyes crinkle like paper. He smiled for his 6-year-old son Max every single morning, because that was the job now. That was the whole job. Wake up, make the eggs slightly burnt because that's how Max liked them. Drive to work at the auto shop on 5th Street. Pick Max up from Mrs. Alvarez's after-school care. Make dinner. Help with homework. Read 1 chapter of whatever dinosaur book Max had checked out from the library. Turn off the light and sit alone in the dark kitchen until he was tired enough to sleep without dreaming about the night Rachel didn't come home from the hospital. Grief, Daniel had learned, doesn't announce itself. It just moves in and rearranges the furniture of your life until you forget where anything used to be. That Saturday afternoon, the campus of Riverside Park was crowded with the particular chaos of early autumn. Leaves the color of rust scattering across the walking paths, dogs barking at squirrels, a church group setting up folding tables for a bake sale near the pavilion. Daniel had brought Max to the park because Max had been asking for weeks, and because the silence of their apartment on weekends had started to feel like a weight sitting on Daniel's chest. He sat on a bench near the swings, a paper cup of gas station coffee going cold in his hand, watching Max climb the little rock wall with the reckless joy that only children seem to still have access to. For a moment, just a moment, Daniel let himself feel something close to peace. Rachel had loved this park. She used to say the old oak trees near the pond looked like they were holding hands underground, their roots tangled together the way families were supposed to be, connected even when you couldn't see it from the surface. Daniel hadn't been able to bring himself to come back here for months after the funeral, not until Max's begging finally wore him down. Standing at the edge of the walking path that first Saturday, he half expected grief to knock the wind out of him the way it usually did in places that still smelled like her memory. Instead, something quieter happened. The autumn light fell soft and gold through the branches. Kids' laughter carried on the breeze, and for the first time in nearly a year, the park felt less like a monument to what he had lost and more like simply a park. That was when he noticed her. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, sat alone on the bench 2 down from his, watching the other kids play. She had a mess of dark curly hair pulled into 2 uneven pigtails, a faded yellow sundress that was a size too big, and scuffed sneakers, except only 1 sneaker. Where her right leg should have continued past the knee, there was nothing. A prosthetic leg, clearly old, clearly outgrown, was propped beside her on the bench like a spare part she hadn't quite figured out how to wear that day. She wasn't crying. She wasn't asking for help. She was just watching, the way you watch a party you weren't invited to, with an expression far too composed for a child her age. Daniel felt something tug at him. Not pity exactly. Recognition. He knew what it looked like to sit on the outside of a life you used to be part of. He knew what it felt like to watch other people move through an ordinary Saturday like it was nothing. Like it wasn't a small miracle just to get through it, while you sat frozen a few feet away, aching quietly so no one would ask what was wrong. Max had noticed her too, in the unguarded way children notice things adults have taught themselves to look past. He'd paused halfway up the rock wall, staring at the girl on the bench for a long moment, before a friend called his name and pulled his attention back to the game. Daniel made a mental note of that pause. Kids, he was learning, often saw the truth of a situation faster than grown-ups did. They just hadn't yet learned all the reasons adults gave themselves for looking away. He didn't say anything to her that day. He told himself it wasn't his place, that she probably had a parent somewhere nearby, that he shouldn't make a stranger's child feel singled out. So he just watched Max play, finished his coffee, and went home. But that night, long after Max had fallen asleep with a dinosaur book open on his chest, Daniel found himself staring at the ceiling, thinking about a little girl sitting alone on a park bench, watching a world that moved too fast for her to keep up with. He didn't expect to see her again. But the next Saturday, there she was, same bench, same faded yellow dress, though it had been washed since, he could tell by the way it hung slightly stiffer. Same watchful eyes. This time, Max ran ahead toward the swings the moment they arrived, and Daniel found himself walking, without quite deciding toward the girl's bench. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, keeping his voice light, the way you'd ask a colleague if a chair was taken. She looked up at him with sharp, assessing eyes, the eyes of a child who had learned early that adults asking permission usually wanted something in return. "It's a park bench," she said. "It's not mine." Daniel almost laughed. He sat down anyway, leaving a respectful distance between them. "I'm Daniel," he said. "That's my son, Max, over there pretending he's a superhero on the monkey bars." The girl studied Max for a moment, then looked back at her own hands. "I'm Nora," she said finally, like she was deciding whether to trust him with even that much. "Nice to meet you, Nora." Daniel didn't ask about the leg. He didn't ask why she was alone. He just sat there, sipping his coffee, letting the silence be comfortable instead of awkward. After a while, Nora spoke again, unprompted. "My grandma's over there," she said, nodding toward the bake sale tables. "She volunteers for the church. I'm not allowed near the playground stuff because Grandma says I might fall and hurt myself worse." "Worse than what?" Daniel asked gently. Nora's jaw tightened, just slightly. "I lost my leg in a car accident 2 years ago. My mom didn't make it. It was just me and her in the car." She said it flatly, the way children sometimes recite facts they've had to explain so many times the words have lost their sting. Or at least, they've learned to make it look that way. "My dad left before I was born, so now it's just me and Grandma. She's real nice, but she's scared I'll get hurt again, so I don't really get to do stuff." Daniel felt his chest tighten in a way it hadn't in months. He recognized the practiced flatness in her voice. He used the same tone when people asked him how he was doing since Rachel died. "That's a lot to carry," he said quietly. "I'm sorry about your mom." Nora shrugged, but her eyes glistened for just a second before she blinked it away. "Everybody's sorry. Sorry doesn't fix a leg." "No," Daniel agreed. "It doesn't, but it's still worth saying, because it means somebody sees you." Nora looked at him then, really looked, like she wasn't used to adults saying things that weren't scripted comfort. "You talk different than other grown-ups," she said. "My wife died 11 months ago," Daniel said, surprising himself with how easily the words came out. "I've had a lot of people tell me they're sorry too. Most of the time it doesn't help. But sometimes, just knowing someone stopped long enough to say it, that helps a little." They sat in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Across the park, Max had made his way over to the bench, curious about the new friend his dad had made. Without hesitation, the way only children can manage, Max climbed up onto the bench on Nora's other side and asked, "Do you want to play pirates? I need a first mate." Nora glanced at her prosthetic leg, then at Daniel, as if asking permission for something bigger than a game. Daniel smiled, a real smile, the kind that crinkled his eyes, for the first time in 11 months. "Go on," he said. "I'll keep an eye on you both." That afternoon, Daniel watched his son and a little girl he'd known for less than 20 minutes turn a park bench into a pirate ship, laughing so loudly that Nora's grandmother, a small, silver-haired woman named Patricia, came over to see what the commotion was about. She introduced herself with the wary politeness of someone used to strangers staring at her granddaughter, but softened quickly when she saw how gently Daniel spoke to Nora, how he never once glanced down at her leg the way most people did. Over the following weeks, Saturday afternoons at Riverside Park became a ritual. Daniel and Max would arrive, and Nora would already be there, saving a spot on the bench. Patricia, exhausted from raising a grieving grandchild alone at 68 years old, began to visibly relax during those hours, grateful for the company, grateful someone else was willing to sit beside her granddaughter without flinching. Daniel learned more about Nora's life in pieces, how the accident had happened on an icy road 2 winters ago, how Nora had spent 4 months in the hospital and another year in physical therapy, how her prosthetic leg was already too small because growing children need new ones every year, and insurance only covered replacements every 3. He learned that Nora loved dinosaurs just like Max, that she wanted to be a marine biologist, that she hadn't laughed, really laughed, in longer than her grandmother could remember, until Max showed up making pirate noises on a park bench. He also learned, from an offhand comment Patricia made one afternoon while watching the kids play, that Nora had been quietly saving allowance money in a jar under her bed for a new prosthetic leg, one with a foot that could actually run, the kind athletes used. She was $7.40 into a leg that cost $12,000, and she didn't know that yet. She just knew she wanted to run. That night, after Max had gone to sleep, Daniel sat at his kitchen table and cried for the first time since Rachel's funeral, not from grief this time, but from something else entirely, something he didn't have a name for yet. The weeks turned into months. Winter came, and with it, shorter Saturdays at the park. But Daniel found himself inviting Patricia and Nora over for dinner instead, then for Thanksgiving, because Patricia's only other family lived 3 states away, and Daniel couldn't stand the thought of that brave, quietly aching girl spending the holiday with just her grandmother and an empty chair where her mother should have been. Max and Nora became inseparable. The way children do when adults aren't around to complicate things with worry, Max never once treated Nora differently because of her leg. If anything, he thought her prosthetic was the coolest thing he'd ever seen, and told her so constantly, until one day Nora finally believed him a little. Daniel began researching prosthetic limbs in his spare time, the kind of quiet, obsessive research a person does when they've found something worth fighting for but haven't admitted it to themselves yet. He learned about running blades, about grants for pediatric amputees, about nonprofit organizations that helped cover costs insurance wouldn't touch. He started setting aside $20 from every paycheck into an envelope he kept in his sock drawer. Not entirely sure what he was building toward, only that he couldn't stop. There were harder days too, days that reminded Daniel this new, fragile family he was building wasn't immune to the world's casual cruelty. One afternoon in February, Nora came home from school quieter than usual, refusing to talk through dinner, refusing even the offer of extra dessert that usually cracked her open. It was only after Max had gone to bed that she finally told Daniel what happened. A boy in her class had knocked her backpack off her desk and, in front of everyone, asked loudly why she walked so weird, laughing until half the room laughed with him. Daniel didn't rush to fix it with easy words. He sat beside her on the couch, let her cry until she was ready to talk, and then told her about the time in middle school when kids used to mock him for the second-hand shoes he wore, because his own family couldn't afford new ones. How it had taken him years to understand that cruelty like that said everything about the person doing it and nothing about the person receiving it. The next morning he called the school, calmly but firmly, and by the end of the week the teacher had organized a class lesson on kindness and differences that Nora later admitted grudgingly wasn't totally embarrassing. It was a small victory. But Daniel understood by then that healing rarely arrives in one dramatic moment. It arrives in 100 small ones, stitched together over time. The same way Nora's confidence slowly stitched itself back together that whole winter. One steady Tuesday dinner and one late-night conversation at a time. It was in March, almost 6 months after that first "Can I sit here?" on a park bench, that everything came into sharp, undeniable focus. Nora had come to visit after school, waiting for Patricia to finish a doctor's appointment, and Daniel was helping her and Max with a jigsaw puzzle at the kitchen table when Nora suddenly went quiet, staring down at the puzzle pieces in her small hands. "Daniel," she said. She'd stopped calling him Mr. Cole months ago, on her own, without anyone asking her to. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything," Daniel said. "Do you think I'm broken?" The question landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. Daniel set down the puzzle piece he'd been holding and turned his chair to face her fully. "Nora, look at me," he said. She did, her chin trembling just slightly, bracing for whatever answer might come. "You are not broken. You are one of the strongest people I have ever met, and I've met a lot of people. You lost something no child should ever have to lose, and you are still here, still laughing, still dreaming about running and marine biology and pirate ships. That's not broken. That's the bravest kind of whole there is." Nora's eyes filled, and this time she didn't blink the tears away. "Everybody looks at me different," she whispered. "Kids at school. Even Grandma sometimes, like she's scared I'll break again." Daniel got down on one knee in front of her chair, the way he used to when Max fell off his bike and needed to know the world hadn't ended. "I don't look at you different," he said. "I look at you and I see a kid who saved my son's Saturdays, who saved mine too, if I'm honest. Before you sat on that bench, I hadn't smiled in almost a year. You did that, Nora. Not because you have 2 legs or 1, because of who you are in here." He tapped gently over his own heart. That was when Nora asked the question that would change everything. The question that, months later, Daniel would replay in his mind every single day for the rest of his life. "Can I sit here?" she asked again, but this time it wasn't about a bench. Her small hand gestured vaguely at the kitchen, at Max, at Daniel, at the whole warm, imperfect life they'd been quietly building together for 6 months without ever naming it. "Like, for good?" "Grandma's getting really tired, Daniel. The doctor says her heart isn't strong anymore. She doesn't say it, but I know she's scared about what happens to me if she can't take care of me anymore. I don't have anywhere else to go. Can I just stay? With you and Max? I promise I won't be any trouble. I'll do my own laundry and everything." The kitchen went completely silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Max looked between his father and Nora, his 8-year-old heart clearly hoping with everything he had. And Daniel felt 11 months of grief and 6 months of quiet, unnamed hope collide inside his chest all at once. He thought about Rachel, about the family they had planned to grow before cancer took that future away in the span of 4 devastating months. He thought about the envelope in his sock drawer, already holding $640 toward a running blade for a little girl who wasn't even legally his to help. He thought about every Saturday at that park bench, about how he used to think his capacity for love had died, alongside his wife, only to discover it had just been waiting for the right person to sit down beside him. He reached out and took both of Nora's small hands in his. "Nora," he said, his voice thick, "I've been trying to figure out for months how to say this without scaring you or your grandmother off. I already called a lawyer 3 weeks ago to ask about guardianship, just in case. I have $12,400 saved for a running blade with your name already picked out for it. I was going to surprise you on your birthday. I've already talked to Max about what it would mean if you became his sister for real, and he told me, and I quote, 'Dad, obviously, why are you even asking?'" He paused, his own eyes finally overflowing. "So yes, you can sit here, for good. For every Saturday and every Thanksgiving and every hard day and every good one. For as long as you want and even on the days you don't want to. Because that's what family does. They stay anyway. You are not broken, Nora. You never were. You're the piece I didn't know was missing." Nora didn't say anything. She couldn't. She just threw her arms around Daniel's neck and sobbed, the kind of full-body crying that comes from a wound finally being allowed to heal, instead of just being managed. Max climbed off his chair and wrapped his small arms around both of them, and for the first time in almost a year, the coal kitchen was filled with something that felt exactly like home. Patricia arrived 20 minutes later to find all three of them still tangled together on the kitchen floor, and when Daniel explained through tears what had happened, what he was offering, not to replace her, never to replace her, but to become the extended family Nora so desperately needed, Patricia sank into a chair and wept with relief so profound it seemed to lift 10 years off her tired shoulders. The legal process took 4 more months. There were home visits, background checks, court dates, and one particularly nerve-wracking hearing where a judge asked Nora directly whether this was truly what she wanted. Nora, sitting in a chair too big for her in a courtroom too formal for an 8-year-old, looked the judge dead in the eye and said, "He's the first person who ever asked if he could sit with me instead of walking past. I want to sit with him forever." There wasn't a dry eye in that courtroom. Even the court-appointed advocate, a woman who had sat through hundreds of guardianship hearings and thought she'd grown numb to the emotion of the job, had to excuse herself briefly to compose herself in the hallway. The judge, a stern-faced man who rarely departed from procedure, took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and told Daniel quietly, before dismissing the court, that in 22 years on the bench, he had never approved a petition with more confidence. Patricia stood outside the courthouse afterward, sunlight catching the silver in her hair, and pulled Daniel into a hug so tight it startled him. "Rachel would have loved you for this," she whispered, though she had never met Rachel, though she only knew her through the photographs on Daniel's mantle and the stories Max told about his mother's laugh. She would have loved that girl too. Daniel didn't trust himself to answer. He just held on, grateful in that moment, for every winding, painful road that had somehow led 3 broken people and 1 small, determined little girl to the exact same bench. Nora officially became part of the Cole family that summer, and on her birthday, Daniel gave her the running blade he'd been saving for, sleek, black, curved like a question mark answered. She unwrapped the box slowly, almost afraid to believe it. And when she finally understood what she was holding, she didn't scream or jump the way Max had predicted she would. She just went very still, tracing the smooth carbon fiber curve with her fingers, and whispered, "It has my name on it," because Daniel had asked the manufacturer to engrave a single word along the ankle, brave. It took her 3 weeks of practice at the physical therapy center to get used to the blade's spring and balance. 3 weeks of falling on padded mats, of frustration and a few tears, of Daniel and Max cheering every single attempt like it was an Olympic final. There were mornings she didn't want to go, mornings she sat on the edge of her bed insisting her old leg was fine actually, and Daniel learned to recognize those mornings as fear wearing the mask of stubbornness. He never forced her. He just laced up his own running shoes and said, "I'll go with you then. We don't have to run. We can just walk to the corner and back." More often than not, that was enough. By the end of August, Nora ran her first full, unbroken lap around Riverside Park, Max sprinting alongside her the entire way, both of them screaming with joy loud enough that half the park turned to watch 2 children run past the very bench where their whole story had started. Daniel stood near the pond where Rachel used to point out the tangled oak roots, tears streaming freely down his face, not bothering to wipe them away, because for once in 11 long months, they weren't tears of loss. They were simply tears of watching someone he loved learn how to fly. Patricia still visits every Sunday for dinner, still just as much a grandmother as she ever was, only now surrounded by more love than she ever thought she'd get to see her granddaughter have. Daniel still sits on that same park bench sometimes, alone, in the early mornings before the kids wake up, remembering the exact moment a little girl in a faded yellow dress asked if she could sit down. and how answering yes to something so small ended up saving both of their lives. Because sometimes the family we're meant to have isn't the one we're born into. Sometimes it's the one we choose. One small, brave, terrifying yes at a time. Sometimes healing doesn't come from moving on from grief, but from making room on a crowded bench for someone else who's hurting too. If this story touched your heart even a little, don't scroll away without telling someone about it. Share it with a person who needs a reminder that kindness still changes lives. And if you want more stories like Daniel and Nora's, stories about second chances, unexpected family, and the quiet courage it takes to let someone sit beside you, make sure you're subscribed, because this is only the beginning of the stories we have to tell. Because in the end, love doesn't ask if you're perfect. It only ever asks one question. Can I sit here? And if you're brave enough to say yes, you might just find the family you never knew you were looking for.